Hi, Steve.
Hey, Rosie.
So, what are we looking at here in this artwork image?
This is a depiction of Pope Urban II giving a speech at Clermont, France in the year 1095. And this is when he called what came to be known as the First Crusade.
So, when you say crusade, what do we mean by that?
So the term crusade isn't applied to these conflicts until later on. Initially, they referred to them as pilgrimages, which were often taken by devout believers to a holy place, in this case Jerusalem. But later on, they came to be called crusades because the crusaders, the people who would take these vows, would wear the symbol of the cross on their clothes. And then in the Old Latin and Italian, that was a crucis signatus, which meant marked with the cross. And from that, we get crusade. So this excerpt is actually from the letter that Urban writes to try and persuade various leaders that they should go on the crusade. At Clermont, we don't know exactly what his speech was. There are lots of people who have written versions of it. I think there are 5 different versions of the speech written down, but none of them are exact replicas, so we don't necessarily know exactly what he said, but we can look at this letter he wrote and get a good sense of what he was up to. So in this letter, he starts by writing, "Your brotherhood," and this is just addressing the group of people he's talking to. It says, "Your brotherhood, we believe, has long since learned from many accounts that a barbaric fury has deplorably afflicted and laid waste to the churches of God in the regions of the Orient." And what Orient means is the East, and what he's referring to is the Byzantine Empire over here in purple. More than this, blasphemous to say, it has even grasped in intolerable servitude its churches and the holy city of Christ, glorified by his passion and resurrection. And the holy city he's referring to is Jerusalem, here in the Near East, where Jesus is said to have been crucified. So it's a holy center for the Christian faith for that reason. And then he goes on, "Grieving with pious concern at this calamity, this disaster, we visited the regions of Gaul," which is another name for France, "and devoted ourselves largely to urging the princes of the land and their subjects to free the churches of the East." So he's asking a lot of the Christians who live in France to go and help out the Eastern churches that have been attacked. And then he finishes by saying, "We solemnly enjoined upon them such an undertaking as a preparation for the remission of all their sins." So what he means by this is that he's telling them, as the Pope, I will forgive all your sins if you go on this mission to free these Eastern churches.
He's giving us a lot of information in this letter about why this first crusade happened, right?
Right. So when we look at it, he's pointing out we want to free the churches of the East, that is the Byzantine churches, and if they do this, he's going to give them a remission of all their sins. That's called an indulgence. So back in the year 1054, we had what was called the Great Schism, which was a division between the Christian church, specifically between Rome and Constantinople, and the 2 patriarchs of the city excommunicated each other over these doctrinal differences. So they were separate churches at this point, but they were still all Christians, and this wasn't that long ago from 1095, and when other Christians are asking for help, Pope Urban II sees this as something that he should still respond to. And on top of that, there was also in the year 1071 a battle between the Byzantines and the Seljuk Turks in blue here at the city of Manzikert, which is right over here. I'll make a dot, where the Seljuks defeated the Byzantines, and that sort of opened up all of Anatolia here, which is modern-day Turkey, to Seljuk conquest. So the Byzantines lost a lot of land after this. Not only is the Eastern Church under threat, but also the Byzantine Empire itself as a political entity is under threat at this point.
Right. So this other point here at the end of Pope Urban's letter, where he talks about the remission of all sins. Again, Steve, I think you mentioned this idea is about indulgences, which is the idea that essentially Christians could have all their sins forgiven by, in this case, going on a pilgrimage to help save Christianity. And what this would essentially do would allow Christians to get into heaven. And this was a really important thing to people who practice Christianity, and it was probably one of the biggest factors of why people went on crusade. They were not necessarily doing it for for money. There wasn't a whole lot of money to be had. So getting this indulgence was a big motivating factor for them.
Right. The point that we want to hammer there is that this is largely religiously motivated. So if they go, they get the remission of sins. He also makes the point about saving Jerusalem, which again is considered a holy city by Christians. It's also considered a holy city by Muslims and Jews as well. So the Christians aren't the only ones who have a vested interest in Jerusalem, but that is one of the reasons that inspires them to go on this crusade.
So, Steve, what was the response to Pope Urban's letter?
So we have the First Crusade, but we should talk a little bit about what that is. So if we're looking at our timeline up here, you can see this. The Council of Clermont is in 1095, and then the First Crusade lasts from about 1096 until roughly 1099. That's when Jerusalem is actually captured by the crusading armies. And there are a couple of different armies involved in this. Three of those armies are led by Frankish nobles, so various leaders coming from this area under control of the Franks here. And a fourth leader is one of the Normans coming out of Sicily down here. But the short version of the story is that these four armies kind of agree to work together. They all head out, meet up at the city of Constantinople, which is the capital of the Byzantine Empire. They meet with the emperor, they make plans with him, and then from there they move on. They help him capture a few cities, and then they go down and capture a few more cities in the Near East here, and then finally take Jerusalem. So that's the story of the First Crusade in a nutshell. But before the professional armies take off, you also have what was called the People's Crusade. The People's Crusade was led by a preacher who was called Peter the Hermit. And we have a picture of Peter here in the front leading his army, his People's Crusade. And this is a group of about 30,000 people who don't want to wait for the military to get ready to go. So these are not trained soldiers. That's why it's the People's Crusade. But they follow Peter. They go through the Rhine Valley here, kind of between where the Franks and the Holy Roman Empire is. And on their way through the Rhine Valley here, they commit a lot of violent acts against Jews in this area too, sort of wrongly interpreting Pope Urban's message about crusading and protecting Christianity as allowing violence against other religious minorities. And then they end up going down through Constantinople. The emperor of the Byzantines doesn't know what to do with all these untrained people, so he basically ferries them across into Turkey, where they are promptly crushed by the Seljuks. And this all happens right before the actual professional armies show up. But then, as I said, they end up being somewhat successful and do take Jerusalem in the year 1099.
So they capture some of these cities in the Near East, and they form these crusader states, which include, as you can see on this map, the county of Edessa is one of the larger ones, and Antioch and some other areas here in the Near East where Christianity sort of gains a foothold here.
Right, so these are states that are run by the Crusaders who conquered this area. And you notice it's not a huge amount of territory, but if we're looking at our big map again, you can see where Jerusalem is there. So it's basically this slice on the far eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. So that's the result of the First Crusade. They take these territories largely from the Seljuks. Jerusalem itself down here is actually captured from the Fatimid Caliphate. So it's important to note that there was not a single unified Muslim state they were fighting against. There were several Muslim states, which probably contributed to their success. So they established these states in the Near East. They're not super long-lived. This occurs in 1099. We said Jerusalem was captured. And the county of Edessa up here to the north actually ends up falling to the Seljuks in the year 1146. So it lasts less than 50 years as a state before it's conquered. But when it is conquered, it prompts what's known as the Second Crusade, which here on the timeline is in 1147. It doesn't succeed in recapturing Edessa, but it does set some other precedents in that the Pope at that time lets crusaders have indulgences for going on other crusades besides those to the Near East. So that's kind of an important development of the Second Crusade. And then in the year 1187, the city of Jerusalem actually is conquered by the Seljuks again. So the kingdom of Jerusalem loses its capital city after less than 100 years in existence. And the loss of Jerusalem prompts the Third Crusade here in 1187. And that is ultimately unsuccessful in recapturing Jerusalem. They get treaty rights so that Christians can still go to Jerusalem, but they don't recapture it. And from that point on, these states continue to exist more or less as you see on the map, minus the city of Jerusalem, minus the county of Edessa, until they slowly lose ground in the 13th century. And then in the year 1291, the city of Acre, you can see on the timeline, falls to the Seljuks, and that was the last stronghold of the Crusader states. So by 1291, the Crusader states in the Near East don't exist anymore. So after the Third Crusade, though, then we see we have the Fourth Crusade and so on. All these yellow blocks represent periods where there are various crusades happening somewhere in the Near East by some Christian European armies. And then in 1291, as I said, that's the end of Crusader states in the Near East.
So this gives us a sense of why the Crusades started and why people joined them and what happened on the Crusades. And in the next video, we're going to look at what some of the impacts of the Crusades actually were.